It's game dev time, and we are going to talk today about making maps. Specifically map mapping for designers, and specifically what we're talking about is world building. We're not talking about, building a level or putting down tiles or something like that. What I really want to talk about is um, how do we create a world, and how does the map influence that world? How do we put together a map of a world that has a real lore behind it, a real history behind it, a culture behind it? And I want to start with the most basic part of the philosophy, which is culture is a product of geography. And I wanted to talk about this in a little bit of detail before I start getting into the other stuff. For those of you who don't know, I actually know a lot about Japan. I actually have a master's degree in international studies Japan, and I spent a lot of time, my undergraduate degree is in history. I spent a lot of time in my life in studies about culture and geography. And when you start looking at why do people act a certain way, as a society, not like why does Bob show up late for lunch, but when you start asking questions about why is it that Japanese people are more polite than Americans. That's a statement we can, or seem more polite. That's probably a statement we can make. Why? Why does Japanese culture include this? Earlier in the stream, I was talking about Japan has a culture of responsibility. Why does Japan have that culture and other cultures don't have this culture where responsibility is such a key thing? And I would argue, and I think a lot of people would argue, that as you kind of break it down, people are a product of their geography. They act a certain way because the place in which they live forces them to act that way, because that is the way that they get the best results. And as that culture evolves, then it creates sort of new cultural hooks that people have to hang on to. I'll give you an example. If you take a look at Japan, for instance, most of this island, to begin with, it's an island or a series of islands. Most of it is one big island, but there's about 5 or 6 major islands of Japan. But if we look at the main island of Japan, it's mostly mountains, like 95% mountains. The rest, and most of that 95% of mountains is totally unusable. It's just, you can't build on it. It's just rocks. And so there's very little usable space here. And the usable space that does exist is broken up into little valleys or little plains along the coast or that sort of place. There's not, for instance, in Germany or France, great big huge rolling plains that go on for hundreds and hundreds of kilometers, or great big huge rolling forests. Japan doesn't have that. It has heavily forested mountains that are largely unusable. And because of that, two things emerge. One, there hasn't, for most of Japanese history, until you could break through those mountains with roads and train lines or better ships that could move along the coast, most of these little isolated areas that you could farm or do whatever in, they didn't communicate very well. There wasn't a big, massive authority that sits over Japan and tells all Japanese people what to do. In fact, most authority comes from local rulers through most of Japanese history. It wasn't until much later, in the Edo period in particular, that Japan really unifies into a single state, because until then, there really wasn't a way to overcome the geography of everything being split up like that. So the other thing it does is people were forced to live in very small areas. And specifically, Japan is it's a rice-based society. The southern part is a rice-based society. The northern part, where there's larger fields, used to survive largely on millet. But most of southern Japan was a rice-growing culture. And rice-growing culture requires that you have rice fields. And rice fields, to be most useful, they don't have to be like this, but to be most useful, they have to be flooded with water. The water actually, this is interesting. I used to always think that rice had to grow in knee-deep water. It doesn't. Rice will grow just fine without the water there, but the water actually prevents anything else from growing. Because rice can grow in water and other plants can't grow in water, the easiest way to weed your rice crop is to submerge it under, half a foot of water. And that's the most efficient way to grow rice. And because you have very, very little space, people were drawn to growing rice because rice was a high density caloric intake crop. You could get a lot of calories per hectare growing rice, much more than you could from growing, say, wheat or millet. So people were drawn to grow rice. And to grow rice most efficiently, you put it underneath water. And to do that required heavy civil engineering to flatten these fields and terrace these fields so that they could hold water over a large area in a flat surface. And you had to control how water comes into these areas. To do that requires a certain amount of cooperation and a local government being able to say, you know what, Bob, I guess not Bob, Kenji, you can't build that field there because that water is needed for these 5 fields over there for these folks. So Kenji, you have to change this. And Kenji has to sort of bow down to the greater authority of the local village because that's the only way that you could build all of these rice fields and make it all work with the kind of irrigation projects and such that you need to do that. That is the heart of a lot of Japanese culture, this having to exist and be successful in a small, close-knit, isolated society. When you start looking at things about Japan, why are these people so polite? Why are these people get along so well? Why are they so tied into the idea that you can't offend other people or you can't upset other people? Well, because they all lived right next to each other in these tiny little communities where they had to get along just to survive. Now, you can compare that back against, I guess you could say, my culture. I was born and raised in America. We'll get, specifically in Texas. We'll get back to that in a minute. But in Texas, our history is very different. We got nothing but space in Texas. We got more land than we know what to use with. If you were to look at the actual usable area in Japan, we have 100 times that in Texas. Just have at it. We still have unused land in that state. After generations of trying to use it all, we still have unused land there. This creates a very different world. Plus, you ain't growing a lot of rice in most of Texas. Now, there are parts in East Texas. Some people have come back, oh, they grow rice. Yes, they grow rice in the swamps of East Texas. But in most Texas, there wasn't enough water to grow rice, and so you grew other crops. Specifically, you grew cows. I don't know if you say you raised cows, I guess. So we had a culture where you grow low water crops like cotton and soybeans, and you raise cattle. And in that world, you don't really have to get along with your neighbors so well, right? I can put a house out on a prairie somewhere. I can get a whole bunch of cows and fence in my area and raise some cows. I don't really care what you think about me and my life and what I do. This creates, and this isn't just Texas, this is, most of Western America. This creates a very different society, a society where things like the freedom to do what I want, the freedom to say what I want, the ability to carry a gun because I need a gun. There's nobody out here. I'm out here all by myself on this little prairie house with me and my cows. And when some stranger comes, there's no one here to protect me. I need a gun to protect myself. These ideas, these things that people see about Americans. Now, obviously, most Americans don't live on farms anymore. Most Americans aren't real worried about someone coming and stealing their cattle. And quite honestly, they probably don't need guns anymore. In the same way that most Japanese people don't live in tiny farming villages in the middle of the mountains somewhere. These ways that we developed our culture have gone away. But the culture remains. And now you can start seeing, why do Americans talk the way they talk? Why do they behave the way they behave? And all of this comes from, at its root, geography. And this is why when I start putting together a culture, when I start trying to build a world, and how is this world going to behave? What are the people in this world going to be like? What is their culture? What is their religion? How do they act? How do they talk to each other? I'm going to start from that geography. Where were the mountains? Where were the roads? Could they talk to each other? Could they move around? All of this comes from that geography. So we have to start with that geography. And then we can build on, what kind of religion would make sense in that society? What kind of culture would make sense in that society, et cetera, et cetera. So I would say when you're starting, if you're world building and you want to put together cultures and history and whatnot, I think one place that a lot of amateur people start with that is incorrect, I guess, is they start with, I really like Spain, so I want my culture to be Spanish, so I'll make a Spanish culture. Well, why was Spanish culture the way it is? Spain has a history. Now, I'm not saying you can't make a Spanish culture. I'm saying go look at why there's a Spanish culture. What created modern Spanish culture? If you are talking about the Spanish conquistador culture, well, you have to look at, well, the conquistadors were warriors that were left over from the wars of the reconquest of Spain and the wars against the Moors, the Muslim people that had taken over southern Spain. And there had been a war between the Catholics and the Muslims in Spain to take over Spain again. And when Spain was reconquered, you had all of these armies and all these well-trained warriors sitting around with nothing to do. And Spain said, well, let's put them on ships and send them over to America and make conquistadors out of them. That's where conquistadors come from. Without that background and that history, you do have to ask, why does my society have conquistadors, right? And these are the kind of questions that, if you're interested in a certain historical period or you want to make your world like a historical period, you need to be asking those questions so that you can start putting together something that makes sense and makes coherent sense. I have more slides, many more slides. So I wanted to share with you how we built the world of Last Regiment. Now, the world of Last Regiment is called Kothia, and Kothia is not the whole world. And that's something I want to talk about. The first thing people do when they build a world is they're like, what's the name of your world? I have a question for you. What's the name of our world? The one we live in right now. What's the name of it? Earth. Means dirt. But most people don't talk about Earth. We don't think about like what world we live in. We live in the world. There's one of them, right? You know, what's the name of the sky? Sky. There's one sky. We named it. Until we knew there were other moons, what was the name of the moon? The moon, right? You didn't have to like, you know, we didn't call this moon Europa or Io or something like that. We just called it the moon because we didn't know there were any other moons. And so a lot of people, they start with like, my world is Aragorn or Snoshnorfer or whatever the fuck your world is called. I actually don't think like that. Most people, you got one world. What's it called? It's called the world, right? So the Kothia is actually not the name of the world. Kothia is the name of a large continent. Now, when we started putting this world together, and we started putting this game together, we had an idea. And the idea that the team had, the sort of basic idea of our world, was I looked at most fantasy games, and I thought most fantasy games come from the Middle Ages, right? And why? Because that's where Tolkien got his lore and his literature. When Tolkien was putting together Lord of the Rings, he drew from old legends, old fairy tales from the Anglo-Saxon period, from old Norse legends, from a very Western European mentality. And a lot of, you know, we think of orcs and elves and such as something that Tolkien came up with. There were goblins and elves and fairies and dwarves. All of those existed in literature long before Tolkien ever started talking about them. He pulled those out of old. He's one of the first people to put it all together in a coherent world and make his own fantasy world. He's obviously, for anyone who's into world building, Tolkien is sort of a god. I'm certainly not saying that he wasn't a god, but specifically, he set his world in the culture that he came from, which, you know, he is obviously English. He comes from this Anglo-Saxon background, and it made sense for him to set a world in that because that's a thing that resonated with him. I was not born in England. I was born in America. I was raised in Texas. What resonates with me? What is my cultural history? And for those of you who don't know much about Boomzap is not an American company. Boomzap is a Singaporean company. Most of the team live in places like Kuala Lumpur or Manila or Singapore. What is their legacy? Where do they come from? What resonates with them? Well, in most of those places, anything before the colonial period of history is pretty dark. There's not a lot of written lore or legend, and I actually don't think it resonates with those people very much. I don't think a lot of people from Manila spend a lot of time thinking about the ancient legends of the Ilocos people or whatnot. I don't think that's a huge thing for them. When you really want to look at where Southeast Asian culture comes from, when you want to look at what really resonates, it largely comes from the colonial period. This is, if you walk through the streets of Manila or you walk through the streets of Singapore, this is where the real history comes from. It comes from that colonial period. and somebody over in chat right now is saying, thanks to the Spanish burning all of our literature. Absolutely true. I'm certainly not putting down the original lore of the Southeast Asian peoples. I don't want to dismiss that. But if you really look at what resonates with most Southeast Asian people on a day-to-day basis, where does their culture come from? It comes from the colonial period. And I thought, it's interesting to look at that as a different place that we could draw our lore and our legends from. And for me as well. I mean, if you look at American history, obviously there is a deep and rich Native American history, but I don't know it, right? I don't know shit about the Iroquois or the Navajo peoples. And I'm not sure that most Americans really resonate with Native American legends or traditions. I don't think that means a lot to most Americans. Most Americans are a product of colonialism. They're a product of England coming over and colonizing America. And so I thought this is a huge part of our legacy, this colonial period, people going and finding a new place and exploring a new place and putting settlements in a new place and trading and all of that. This background and this history, this is, I guess, if Tolkien looks at the Middle Ages, this is our Middle Ages. This is what somebody from America or somebody from Southeast Asia has. And I thought it might be interesting to play around with that as a core legend or a core lore for a fantasy game. And so I thought, well, what if it had been the case that foreigners had landed in a new continent, and instead of finding Maori people or the native Filipinos, I don't know what the native Filipinos of Manila were called. Somebody in chat, please tell me what the native Filipinos of Manila were called. The Tagalog people, I don't know, that's their language. I don't know what the hell the people were called. Or instead of finding Iroquois and Cherokee in America, they found orcs and goblins and wizards and monsters and magic, and they encountered this magical world, and they tried to colonize this magical world. I thought that might be a really interesting kernel for our world. And so I started with this map that you can see. And when I draw my first maps, I like to draw with a pen or with a pencil and an eraser. I know the world is digital, but I just like to sit down with a piece of paper and a pencil. And so I have a sketchbook, and I sat down with my sketchbook and I started drawing a coastline and, some ideas. And I could go into a lot of detail about where do the rivers come from and where do the mountains come from. But you know what? The internet has a world of that. I mean, the short version is you're going to start with your mountains and you're going to say, where are your mountain ranges? Well, here's a great big mountain range. And usually a mountain range trails off to a series of islands, because what a mountain range is, when two continental plates bang into each other and go like that and the mountains rise up, and then rain and shit falls down on the mountains, and the mountains gradually deteriorate into hills, right? Hills are rounded hills are not younger than big mountains. The tallest, biggest, steepest mountains are usually the youngest ones. And over time, they wear down into hills. So if you go, for instance, to America, the Rocky Mountains, which are way more, pointy, are much younger than the Appalachian Mountains, which are way more sort of rounded and rolling, because the Appalachian Mountains have had millions and millions of years to be worn down by frost and rain and whatnot. And if you look, and go look at a map of the world, go look at close-up maps of the world and look at mountain ranges, you'll see mountain ranges usually spin into a series of islands as those fault lines go into the sea and go further down and become covered by water. If you look at rivers, rivers tend to go from high places to low places, because that's how water flows, right? So rivers will usually start somewhere up in the mountains and they will go towards the sea. So once you know where your mountains are, it's pretty easy to draw a river. So if we look here in this area, and this center area is where most of the game of Last Regiment is played. Here's this big sort of bunch of mountains that kind of curl up along here, that spin out into this Rumen archipelago out here. And then along the edges of these mountains, you can see these rivers come, and they come from this sort of highlands of the mountains. Now, I thought it would be interesting to have a great big lake as part of our thing. I thought that would be a fun place to go explore someday, is on the shores of this lake. Partially because I happen to have my father has a lake house in the Great Lakes, and I thought, it's kind of neat to go to the Great Lakes and stand on the edge of a lake and have it be so big you can't see across it. So I created this lake in here, and I said, what makes lakes? Well, what makes lakes is where there's a depression in the land where the water flows down to it and it can't get out. So the water rises and rises and rises until finally it finds somewhere where it can get out, and then it runs into a river and goes out. And so I decided I wanted this great big lake here. So I put this lake here, kind of curled in the nook of these mountains. And then I said, the other thing that I thought would be interesting is a really long river. I thought of, for instance, the Amazon River or the Congo River or the Mississippi River, and all of these great stories that come from going up a big, long river. So I decided that this lake would flow into a river, but there'd be mountains here. There's a highland and a mountain here. So this river can't make it out to the sea. So it has to curl around down here through another lake. And then there's another map where it kind of curls around and goes to the sea somewhere else. So now I've got a couple things that I wanted. I wanted this archipelago. I cannot say that word. This bunch of islands. I wanted this bunch of islands out here because I was thinking about the American experience and how when we came to America, we didn't originally land on America. We actually originally, when Columbus landed in America, he didn't land in Florida or Virginia. He actually landed in Hispaniola. He landed on one of the islands in the Caribbean. And they kind of had to island hop and explore the islands before they got to mainland. And I thought that was an interesting thing. And I thought, as I'm going to be building out my history, I thought it would be fun to have a city in those islands that would be sort of between the old world and the new world, where people would come from the old world and they would use that city as a jumping point to get to the rest of the new world. So I kind of started from, I want to have these islands and somewhere to go from there to this other place. So we have these Rumen Islands, which has, used to be called Saltia Ruma, but somebody mentioned, and I thought Saltia Ruma was a cool name until somebody said, what, Salty Aroma? And then I was like, fine, it's not Salty Aroma, because apparently Salty Aroma was, Anyway, so it became Port Ruma. So Port Ruma is the sort of first port of call when you're going to the new world from the old world. And then I wanted to have this kind of large sea, so they would be somewhere that they could explore the coast of. And this is something else to think about when you're building your world is, how do you want the player to experience? How do you want somebody to experience it? Now, for me, a big part of this was I wanted the player to feel like he was part of the exploration of a new world. And so I wanted to have that history of here's how it got explored. And I didn't want it to start with a player. The player is not the first person to go there. Because if the player is the first person to go there, it's all unknown. I wanted it to be somewhere in the middle of that, where there's things that are known and things that are not known. So I built this world. So that was my first step. Second step was, well, I guess I need an old world for people to come from. And I'm sorry this map is so crap. It scanned in poorly. So this was my original first map. You'll notice these kind of arrows. I can't remember if I had the arrows on this other one. Later on, I drew arrows in. You'll see these arrows in the sea. One of the things that when you're putting your world together, if you've put your mountains down, actually sort of the next step of putting your mountains down is, where does the wind go? Where does the wind flow, and where does sea currents go? Because that's going to determine where it rains, right? So when I wanted to start putting down forests and putting down rivers and where rivers and forests go, I kind of wanted to think about where do these sea currents go? And it's particularly in my game, this was interesting to me because it's a game where the core lore is about an old world and a new world. And I thought about when the first colonists came to America, they actually, if you ever wondered why the colonists came where they came and went where they went, because there's a circular current in the Atlantic Ocean. And when you came in one direction, you would go north, and when you went back the other direction, you would go south to follow those circular currents. And those circular currents actually define where got settled first and where got settled later. If you look, almost nobody ever goes directly across the Atlantic Ocean because it's actually, the middle of the Atlantic Ocean is a dead zone. There's no wind there. And so they would come around one way and they would go back the other way. And because of that, it actually affects the way that the places get settled. So for me, the currents were very important. So I started with, where are my land masses? Where are my mountains? Next, I asked, how would that affect wind? How would that affect sea currents? From there, I can now know, where does it rain? Right? And when you're asking where does it rain, it's very simple, straightforward stuff. You can take a look at a map of Seattle as a perfect example. Weather comes this way, hits the mountains that are right, here's Seattle. It hits the mountains right behind Seattle and it rains in Seattle. And right on the other side of the mountains, there's no rain because all the rain has fallen on Seattle. You can look at Japan as another great example. Where I live in Japan, on the Tokyo side, right now we're having a beautiful dry winter, just like we always do. It almost never rains in the winter here. Why? Because in the winter, the wind current changes. We get all of our wind out of Siberia. That wind from Siberia hits this, comes through Korea, hits the Sea of Japan, picks up all that moisture, and then dumps that moisture on the west coast of Japan. There's places over on the west coast of Japan, the Sea of Japan side, that get something like 16 meters of snow in the winter. By the time that wind gets over the mountains and over here to the east side of Japan, it's all snowed out. And because it's all snowed out, we get these really, really dry winters. So dry that I have to put lotion on my hands to keep myself from having cracked, bitter hands, me and the rest of Tokyo. In the summer, the wind pattern changes and we get our weather out of the Philippines. And we get these wet, nasty storms that come up from the Philippines. So we get long, wet, hot winters. How does this matter? Take a look at Japan. Where are all the cities in Japan? Now, you would think, if you were a basic designer and you were putting together a world, you would think most of the cities of Japan would be on the west side of Japan, close to China, close to Korea. They would trade across the Sea of Japan, blah, blah, blah. Almost all of the cities of Japan are on this side of Japan, on the east side of Japan, facing this great big Pacific Ocean that nobody can cross for thousands of years. Why? Because if you were on the west side of Japan, every winter you would be under 16 meters of snow, and you couldn't survive that. People couldn't live over there. And so no great big huge settlements actually got built on that side of Japan. They got built on this side of Japan because this was the only side that you could actually survive in. So these kind of things affect your world building. They affect where your cities will go if you want them to make sense. And you can look at maps, I would suggest one of the most interesting things to do is to go look at maps of the world that we live in and ask yourself, why are things the way that they are? And by the way, over in chat, people are like, wow, this is getting way nerdy. Oh, hold on there. Hold on to your hats. This gets way nerdier. The nerd in this is going to be fucking epic. You don't even know how far the nerd goes in this. So yeah, you don't have to encourage me. I have slides prepared. The nerd in these slides is amazing. You just wait for it. I'm on slide 2 of 20 something. Hang in there. So anyway, the next thing I wanted to look at is scale and how big is this world? And this is something that I struggle with young designers a lot, because if you read novels and such, it's very common that there's only 6 features in their world. They're like, this is the mountain, this is the river, this is the swamp, and that's it, right? Because that's all they care about for their novel, which is fine. I mean, I get it. That's fine. But if you're actually creating a real world, a livable world that you can tell stories in and blah, 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 how big is it? And how varied is that world, right? I want to give you an example. So in the middle here, you can see this is if you remember from the map that I drew a second ago, this is the new world. This is the coast of the new world that we're going to in Kothia. Well, here it is after I'd put in some rivers and put in some jungles and forests, and you can see this great big lake Ixmal here. How big is this? Well, I thought about the colonization of America, and I thought about how big that space was and how big the 13 colonies were. And I wanted to know that our world was of a similar scale, similar size. So I said, this area in the yellow box, this is where most of the things in our game take place. Now, there's a whole world outside of that. There's a whole world of Kothia that we don't go to in our game. And that's out there for providing lore and for providing stories, or, later game additions and such like that. Maybe we travel down to the jungles or we go wherever. So I looked at how big is our area. So this yellow box here is our area. And I said, that's probably about the same size as, say, Virginia, North Carolina, West Virginia, a big hunk of where the original colonies were. And I thought about how varied in landscape and geography is even just the state of Virginia. If you think, I don't know if anyone here's ever been to Virginia. My family is originally I was born and raised in Texas, but my family was originally from Virginia. They were from Virginia Beach. And I spent a lot of my youth driving across Virginia to go visit my grandparents. I visited them every summer. There's mountains in Virginia. There's forests. There's a huge swamp. There's the Chesapeake Bay area. Just in the Tidewater area alone, which is this little tiny tip right here, just in that area alone, there's forests and swamps and things. And you ask yourself, how long would it take you to walk? And this is another thing. I think because people are born and raised in this world where you can hop on a plane and go across the world in, a couple hours, where you can get in a car, a drive from Virginia Beach, Virginia, which would be right here at the sort of bottom tip of Virginia, a drive from there to, say, Washington, D.C., which is sort of up here, that's only about a 4 or 5 hour drive. But in the world of a fantasy world, how long would that take to walk or ride a horse? If we look at the Civil War, almost all of the Civil War, all the major battles of the Civil War were fought pretty much in this yellow box. They fought a whole war in this with campaigns and people, wintering over, these areas in a world where the fastest thing you could do was hop on a horse are huge, immense. So anyway, I wanted to give people kind of a scale for the world. So I kind of put this down and said, okay, well, this is the scale of the world, right? And then I kind of wanted to say, well, my team's not from Europe or North America. So I wanted to put it in terms they might understand because they're from Southeast Asia. So I said, well, okay, we're about, and I looked on a map and spent some time with Google Earth, we're about the size of northern Thailand, right? And that kind of puts it into some perspective for you. There's a lot that can go on in northern Thailand, right? And then maybe to give a little bit more perspective, and I apologize for the fact that this is a Mercator projection map, but I did not have time to put this all on a globe for you. But I kind of dropped this on top of Europe so we could see, okay, this is how big the world is. Now, once I had done this, because this is the part of the map that I'm most concerned with, because this is the part where our story takes place. But remember, I've got a whole world outside of where the story takes place, and I want to think about that whole world outside of where the story takes place. So I dropped it on top of this map of the world, and then I started drawing the rest of the world on top of this map of the world. So you can see over here, there's Japan and the Philippines and blah, blah, blah. And I wanted, in my mind, I wanted Kothia to be kind of the size of Asia, kind of Asia-ish in size. So I kind of put this on top of Asia and started drawing out. And you can see it gets a lot more loose as I get further away from where the story is. So I know there's kind of a big island down here. I know there's kind of a big, huge cape-like peninsula and a sea down here. I kind of get that. I know there's a bunch of jungle islands and a jungle sea down here, but I haven't really gotten to it. And then this area here is quite detailed. And then over here on the left, this is the old world. This is the world that we're coming from. Now, our game is entirely set in the new world. So I haven't spent a lot of time detailing out the old world. But I do need to know, for purposes of the story, where are people coming from? Are they coming from Portela? Are they coming from Zalov? Are they coming from Toya? What are these kingdoms like? And for me to build that history and for me to build that lore, I go back to my original statement of this all has to come from some kind of geography. So I needed to kind of put some geography together for the old world. So this is the old world, which I've seen as being sort of stuck to the northern ice sheet. And it's the land goes up underneath the ice sheet, but you can't get up to most of that. So there's probably some sort of place where the world starts to get real frosty and cold. And then Portela looks like a flattened Australia, says some of the people in the chat. I actually, if you want to know where Portela actually comes from, that comes from the islands of Indonesia. I was looking at a number of islands of Indonesia, and I kind of wondered what would it look like if I kind of had this spread of islands. And when I was building this, because it goes both ways, you don't have to just build a bunch of mountains and then figure out what happens in them. If you know what you want your society to be like, you can build a world based on that. And so, for instance, Portela is a great example of that. I wanted Portela to be an empire. And the difference between a kingdom and an empire is that an empire has a lot of little kingdoms inside of it, right? There's an emperor over these lands. And the idea that the lands would be very different and have different languages and different cultures and different histories. And because I wanted that, I thought an archipelago of islands would make sense for that. So I had sort of a main island with a main agricultural area. And I decided that's where the root of Portela would be. That's where the Cajellan Portelans are. And those are the Portelans that build their own empire. And they build that empire by taking over the islands around them. And they build this large Portelan empire that includes other kinds of Portellans who have a different language and a different culture. Maybe they look different from each other, but they're all part of the Portellan Empire. This is as opposed to the northern kingdoms, and I wanted the northern kingdoms to be a non-empirical world, a place where there were kingdoms and those kingdoms were still fighting and they were still independent, of which Zalov is the most powerful and important, where Toya is the largest, a large agricultural northern society that's constantly at war with Zalov. And these two sort of put up against the idea of Portella as a large imperial group, all of them trying to colonize this new world. That was where my head was at when I was building all this. So I built a land that made sense for all that. And so this is actually where this map still is. I haven't bothered to detail out all of far eastern Kothia. We haven't gotten there yet. And that's fine. And this is something, again, a place a lot of people mess up, I think, and I sometimes mess up here, is you can go pretty far down this rabbit hole if you put your mind to it. I could have spent a long period of detailing out all of the different forests and blah, blah, blah. I could spend every week, and I would happily do it. Nothing makes, I'm a huge map nerd. I would love to sit and do that. But at some point, I got to, build a game. So you got to start nailing some stuff down and saying, well, this is how it is. Let's go. And so, as you can see, it kind of gets more and more detailed the closer you get to the places where we're actually going to have game, and less detailed when I get further away from it. Now, you don't know how big the world is. And I want to talk about this a little bit. I'm speaking directly to my designers because I still see them doing that. And to do this, I want to go talk about Texas history for a little bit. For those of you who don't know, that's my home. I'm from Texas. Specifically, I was born and raised right outside of Dallas, right here in a small suburb called Garland. As everyone says, the best part about coming from Garland is, don't matter where you go, gonna be better. That's not me. I want to be clear that the cute kid is not me. When I searched online for Texan, that was the number one image that I found for Texan, and I just thought he was adorable. I was like, that kid's so cute. I got to put him in my slide. And then I thought, like, I put that kid in my slide, and everyone would be like, oh, it's a cute kid, but where's Texan Chris? All right, fine. That's me and my mom when I was a kid in Texas with a horse. There we go. Texan street cred taken care of. Yep, that's me right there feeding that. I'm ashamed to say, and this is the least Texan thing I have ever said, that horse's name is Cupie Pie. It was not my horse, but that horse's name was Cupie Pie. So yeah, I'm old enough to have black and white photos. That's absolutely true. And that horse, I rode that horse when I was a kid, and that's my mom. And also I used to be a blonde, and come on, I was cute. But anyway, I digress. I wanted to talk about the Battle of San Jacinto. I'm about to make a game in which we're going to wander around America. Well, not America, Kothia. We're going to wander around Kothia, and we're going to have battles. And as I wander around Kothia and have battles, I was noticing that our designers were like, okay, you're going to go from here to here to here, and all these, and, wow, we really have to move. And I wanted to kind of give you an idea. This yellow box is still the same size as the yellow box that we got before, right? Now I have put this yellow box around Texas, still about the same size. So this is where I grew up. Texas is about the same size as northern Thailand. Northern Thailand could happily fit within Texas. So for those of you who don't know, Texas used to be a country. We actually were a country for 10 years. The Republic of Texas. Woohoo! For those of you, have you ever wondered why Texas had a Six Flags of Texas? The reason is that we had Six Flags. We were originally, originally we were Native American, but nobody talks about that because, white people. But after we stole the land from the Native Americans, we were Spanish. And there was a huge area of this that was all Spanish. There was a war of independence, and a big hunk of Spain becomes Mexico. And that big hunk of New World Spain that became Mexico included Texas, as well as California, New Mexico, and a bunch of other places. There was then, in the 1830s, a war where a bunch of white people basically said, we don't want to be Mexican no more. And they had a war with Mexico and became the Republic of Texas, which didn't look exactly like Texas right now, but took a big hunk of space that was kind of like Texas. We then become American, and we have an American flag. Woohoo! The eastern part of Texas actually belonged to France for a long time, so it had a French flag. And then we were Confederate because we were one of the southern states in Confederate War. That's why we have 6 flags over Texas. But anyway, I digress from my digression. Texas War of Independence. Bunch of folks in Texas say we don't want to be Mexican anymore. We want our own country for a number of reasons. I won't get into that, but there was a war. Now, this map above my head here, I will make it a little bigger for you real quick. This kind of shows you where the battles of the War of Texas Independence took place. And you can again imagine that this is the same size as the yellow box here, right? So this yellow box, which is in the world of Kothia, the Forest of Mir, and some mountains and stuff around it, is roughly the same size as this box right here. And you can see the entire War of Texas Independence took place in, you know, this small little subset of that. And this is a war that took years. Took multiple years of armies moving around and blah, blah, blah. The war ends with the Battle of San Jacinto. And this is one of the bloodiest, nastiest battles in American history. It was thankfully quite small. There weren't that many people involved. I believe the Mexicans had a couple thousand people. The Texans had like 1,500 people in the whole battle. It wasn't a whole lot of people, but almost all the Mexicans died. It was one of the bloodiest, nastiest battles in American history. Most people don't know about it. And for those of you who have heard of the Alamo, the Alamo was a Spanish mission. You can see it's in downtown San Antonio right now. If you ever go to PAX, it's across the street from PAX in San Antonio. And at the time, it was a Spanish mission sort of out in the middle of nowhere. And there were a bunch of Texans holed up in the Alamo trying to defend themselves against a larger larger Mexican army. And they didn't surrender. They refused to surrender. And when they refused to surrender, the Mexicans killed pretty much every last one of them. And a number of famous characters die in this. Davy Crockett, if you ever heard of him. And I believe Travis died in this. Stephen F. Austin, I believe, died in that. The number of famous people died in this battle. And obviously the Texans were pretty pissed off about this. Yeah, Bowie dies in that. So not David Bowie, not Spaceman David Bowie, but anyway, after this battle, the Texans are absolutely enraged. There'd been a massacre. They were furious. And there was a huge group of volunteers that joined in the Houston area down here, which at the time was not, Houston didn't exist. There was nothing called Houston down there. It was Galveston, was a coastal settlement. But that's where a lot of Texans lived, in the plains near Galveston. And a bunch of people said, we're going to join the army. We're going to go kill these Mexicans. I can't believe what they did to us at the Alamo. And they were led by a guy named Sam Houston, which eventually Houston gets named after. So Sam Houston's now the leader of this large army of Texan volunteers who don't know shit about being soldiers. They know nothing. And so the Mexicans are like, let's kill them while they're young. So the Mexicans chase them around Texas for a little bit, and the Texans get increasingly angry because they're like, we want to fight those Mexicans. And Sam Houston is like, you are not ready to fight those Mexicans. They're going to kick your ass. And so they kind of wander around Texas for a little bit, and the people Sam Houston is leading are getting increasingly upset because they didn't just join this army to wander around the Texas swamps and run away from Mexicans. They wanted to go kill some people. And so finally, they get kind of backed up against a river. Now, here's what's interesting. Here you can see all this geography and all of that. When we actually talk about the Battle of San Jacinto, this is the actual map of the Battle of San Jacinto. And you can see there's a little tiny bay and the San Jacinto River and Peggy's Lake and all of these. If you're into Texas history, I could get into all the details. But the point is, looking at this map of Texas, you don't see any of that shit, right? This is all inside this tiny little sort of thing right there, which is San Jacinto. And in a world map, you wouldn't see that, you wouldn't know it. And again, getting back to the map of Kothia that we put in our game, the size of the map of Kothia that you see in your game, You don't see any of these things. But on a tactical level, when you're talking about an actual battle, the things that really matter, the swamp and the forest and the open space and where the river is, and we can assume this is about the size of a last regiment tactical map, an actual map that the players play on, has no relationship whatsoever to your world map. I mean, it does in the sense that there's the San Jacinto River, and if I looked on a map of Texas, I could find the San Jacinto River, but none of these details are there. That swamp is not there. Those forests is not there. And so I've seen designers that are very like, okay, I've got this one battle and I need it to happen on an island, and they look at the world map and they're like, where's the island on the world map? No, you don't need that. You can put a dot anywhere on the map and you can make pretty much whatever you want out of it, because the world is really big. And even in a battle, and this was a battle that had, like I say, 3,000-4,000 people in it. I'd have to look that up. I'm not sure. I think I may be overstating that, maybe less than that. But this is a battle that had thousands of people in it. It was a battle that changed the face of the world, a battle that created an entire nation. All takes place in a field that big, a field that you know, the area, I don't see on this map. I don't think there's a legend for how big things are, but you're really talking about maybe a couple kilometers on a side. So much, much smaller than you think it is. By the way, for those of you who are curious about Texas history and want to know how this ended, this is a terrible battle. What ends up happening is the Texans kind of get up in this bunch of trees. You can see where they were in that Texan camp up in the trees, and they're resting in the trees, and they're backed up against this river. They can't really go anywhere. You can see that the Mexicans had them kind of backed up against this river that they couldn't cross. They couldn't go into this swamp, and so the only way that they could get out was to get on this road and go across the bridge over to Lynchburg. But they couldn't do that without facing the Mexicans, and the Mexicans were like, "We got them," and you know they've run from us every time we've gotten them. We finally got them pegged. Now we're going to kill them. But the thing is, the Mexicans have been chasing these Texans for so long, they were absolutely exhausted. And they had just gotten a bunch of fresh reinforcements that were absolutely dead on their feet, tired. And they thought, look, these Texans have never actually fought us. There's no way they're going to attack us. Let's all go to sleep. And so the Mexicans made camp and went to sleep, literally 500 meters, 750 meters away from the Texans. And the Texans are enraged. They've been like, why can't we kill Mexicans? Which, you know, for those of you who've ever talked to Texans, you know this is a theme with us. And so they were gung-fire ready to fight. And so they attacked the Mexicans with no warning whatsoever. And most of the Mexicans were like still in bed. And it was an absolute massacre. Almost every Mexican gets killed. A couple managed to escape. The entire Mexican army is destroyed and routed. And the Texans lose like 10 or 15 people. It was almost nobody. Sam Houston gets shot in the ankle, which was a wound he lived with for the rest of his life. Apparently getting shot in the ankle really sucks. So he limped for the rest of his life from it. But this is where, for those of you who ever heard the saying, remember the Alamo, that's what was happening. Is they were all pissed off about what had happened at the Alamo, and they went and the Mexicans tried really hard to surrender. In the Alamo, nobody surrendered. The Mexicans killed everybody. But that's because they wouldn't surrender. And the Mexicans were like, dude, why don't you surrender? We're going to kill all of you. And they wouldn't surrender. So the Mexicans killed them all. But in the Battle of San Jacinto, the Mexicans were like, dude, we surrender. And the Texans were like, fuck you, no. And they killed all of them. And there's a famous saying that the Mexicans actually tried to escape across the San Jacinto River. And Sam Houston famously says that the only way that they'll escape is by walking on the backs of the corpses of their dead friends. So yeah, there's a little bit of Texas history for you. But the reason I talk about all of that is all of this wonderful storytelling about the river and crossing the river on the backs of their dead friends and them being camped in a woods and there being a swamp nearby. If I show you this larger map, none of that is there. And when you're making your world, I would highly suggest to you that these larger maps of where the rivers are and where the mountains are and where everything is, that's strategic, right? We went up the river to go up into this forest. But when you get into the forest, there's a little bit of the forest that's got swamp. There's a little bit of forest that's got forest. These tactical maps, and I could run through, for those of you who are in the war games and stuff like that, there's little tactical maps like this for every battle. you can think of for Gettysburg and for the Civil War, the Revolutionary War, the War of Spanish, whatever war you can think of. There's these little maps, and they're a wonderful resource. If you are a designer and you're trying to put together maps and you're trying to put together strategic situations, they're a wonderful resource to go look at. This, for instance, is an interesting layout for a tactical map if you wanted to do that. I want to talk a little bit about letting the player discover things. And this is our map of Kothia. You can see down here at the bottom, here's the Forest of Mir that we've been talking about and some of these lakes. Here's that great big Lake Ixmal. I pointedly haven't drawn anything over here. And actually, all of this area up here in the north, I've kind of detailed it a little bit, but we don't actually go there. This is there for lore. This is there for feeling. But there's also places we haven't been yet. Now, obviously, from a game designer perspective, part of this is because I want to build some stuff later. I don't have to build it all right now. I'll get to it. But the other thing is, when you're building out your world, resist doing all the work for you. Resist making everything done, and go ahead and leave some parts of the world open for players to explore. Now, this is particularly for those of you who are making role-playing games. You're making a world for Dungeons and Dragons or something like that, and God knows I've made a number of D&D worlds. Leave some big open spaces. One of the things that's, if you ever read like the R. Haggard books or the Tarzan books, they go to Africa, and what was exciting about Africa, the reason why everybody wrote books about Africa in the Victorian age is because there were certainly people in the center of Africa. I don't want to say that Africans weren't in the center of Africa, but white folk ain't been in the center of Africa yet. And so it was interesting for them to make shit up, because in a 1790s sorry, I'm getting my periods mixed up. In an 1890s map of Africa, there were still great big hunks of it that were like, we don't know what's out here. And that's why it was an interesting place to write books about during the Victorian period. This is why the Jules Verne books were about the center of the earth, or they were about the exploration of Antarctica or the exploration of northern Canada, places that were still undiscovered. And so I would encourage you, when you're building your worlds, your fantasy worlds that you want players to be interested in and explore, you don't have to make all of it. And it's better that you don't. Leave some of it open, because that's where the mystery is. That's where the adventure happens. And in point of fact, a lot of this area that I have detailed out here, it's not really that well known yet to our players at the beginning of the game. I left it on the map because I thought it was pretty, but in terms of the lore, some of this remains unexplored. So the next thing I want to talk about is... Yeah, and so Javi is saying over in chat, that's why we write about space and deep in the ocean now. This is, it's interesting. I'll go back to my pretty map because it's a nice background. I do, in my spare time, I do a lot of writing. And I struggle because my favorite books are Victorian age exploration novels. I love the Tarzan novels. I loved the Jules Verne novels, all of these novels of going and exploring things. And we live in a world now where I can pull up, if I wanted to, I could pull up on this screen right now and show you, the car parked in front of my house, or the car parked in front of everyone's house in this chat, if I knew where their address was, because we have satellites out there. We know where everything is now. And so now when we start writing literature, the adventure exploration novel has to be a historical novel at this point, because we don't have places to explore. Or it has to be science fiction, where we're exploring the planets or something like that, because that exploration of somewhere new is a thing that people like and people are drawn to. So yeah, that's a thing. So in this, I want to talk about drawing from history and from reference. And here I don't have a bunch of slides or anything, but history does a lot of heavy lifting for you. And that's okay. I know a lot of people want to invent everything whole from scratch. They want it because that feels great to them. Oh, yeah, I invented this whole world. And you know what? I could make an entirely new world. I can make an entirely new world where everything was based, instead of on carbon, on argon, and it was on the planet, and nobody would relate to it. Nobody would know what the hell that is. When we draw from history, when we start saying, I want to make a world, and I want that world to, I don't know, be kind of like the Spanish colonial period, or to be kind of like the Middle Ages in France. When we have that pin to draw from in our fantasy worlds, it does one thing. One, does a lot of the heavy lifting, because what do they eat? Well, I don't know. What did they eat in France in 1120? You can find that out, right? What kind of technology did they have? Blah, blah, blah. All of these questions about your world, you can look the answer up and you can find it. And you don't have to invent it. And that saves you a lot of time, because as much as this world building is fun and interesting, most people are not that into your world. They're into the story that is taking place in that world. What people really read novels for, what people really get into fantasy fiction for, is the interaction between characters, how people interact, and they like to learn about new characters and how do they respond in certain situations. And if everything is completely alien to them, how do they know how things are supposed to act? You know, it's one of the interesting things. I know a lot of people bitch about, there's a sort of genre of novels and fantasy and fiction that is, white person goes somewhere where white people aren't. You can look at, for instance, Last Samurai. A lot of people bitched about The Last Samurai, and they were like, how come you put a white person in The Last Samurai? Why couldn't you have a Japanese samurai as the last? Yeah, I get that. There's a reason why there's a white dude in The Last Samurai. Because white people are watching this movie and they need to have shit explained to them because they don't know, right? If there were a Japanese dude that was raised in Japan and knew everything about all of this, nobody in that story would have to sit him down and be like, well, let me explain to you the way things are here, right? But by having a character from outside of that society come into that society, we now have this really easy way to say, all right, this is why we have to explain this to you. This is why this is new. And you get to watch somebody explore that new society. This is a trope that you see. You know, if, what was the movie? Avatar. If Avatar only had aliens in it and there weren't any humans in Avatar, it would be very difficult for you to relate to it, because the aliens would be thinking crazy alien thoughts and doing crazy alien stuff, and you wouldn't know why the crazy aliens were doing the crazy alien stuff that they were doing. But by putting humans in that situation, now the crazy aliens have to explain to the human why they're doing what they're doing and what they're doing. That's something that players or watchers, or however you want, whatever your audience for your fantasy can be, they can understand what's going on. And so when you're putting your fantasy world together, it makes life a lot easier. The blue people avatar. The other thing is they have an image of things. And a lot of people have dreams, right? If you think about, you know, one of my, I read a lot of Tolkien. And when I hop into a fantasy world, I want to play an elf. I like elves. Elves are cool. When I played Dungeons and Dragons, I almost always played elves because I liked elves. And when somebody builds a fantasy world and they say, our fantasy world doesn't have any elves in it, screw elves, I'm like, but I want elves. I play in this because I want to play an elf. And especially in games, I think even more than literature, I think especially in games, we're inviting people to come into our world and share our dream, share our ideas about what a world could be like, whether that world is a fantasy world or whether that world is a science fiction world. And when we tell them that, they're not coming into this blank. They're coming into this with things that they like and things that they don't like and things that they're interested in. And we kind of need to provide them with some of that. If you create a fantasy world and you don't put any elves or any orcs or any goblins in it, a lot of people are going to come to your fantasy world and say, but I like fantasy games because I like playing elves. And where are the elves, goddammit? And so that's a thing as well. People come into your game with images and dreams, and if you don't give them that, they're going to feel unfulfilled sometimes. So let them have it. You know, you don't have to make it all up yourself. That being said, you can play around with what people know and play around with their expectations. So I'll give you a good example that we did in Last Regiment. I wanted goblins in the game, but I feel like the goblin trope of, you know, it's a little goblin, like that thing that is in World of Warcraft, you know. I'm a stingy little and they're kind of a weird. I don't know. They've always felt very anti-Semitic to me. I don't know. That's just me, but I've never really liked those kind of goblins. And I thought to myself, what are goblins? What would a goblin feel about himself? Like, what would a goblin society be if you were a little person that lived out in the woods or lived down in a cave somewhere, and you kind of had to fight for your right to party, whatever. If you were that, what would that be like? And I got to thinking, like, they would probably be very fierce. They'd probably be very tough. In a society where, you know, they fought a lot, you would be strong and you would think about strength as something important. You can play around with it. And so our goblins in Last Regiment, they look kind of goblin-y, but they have an entirely different kind of society. A society based on being brave, a society based on being strong, a society based on being independent and resisting the colonial movement. And they're kind of a different thing than what you normally expect goblins to be. And that's fine. That's kind of interesting. It was the same with elves. I looked at elves and somebody drew a picture very early on in the process of an archer. And the archer had this bow. And the bow had like cool gears and mechanical bits on it. And I thought, that's a really interesting image. That's a cool image. And I want to put that in my world. How does it work? And then I thought about elves. And I thought about elves as a general trope. And, you know, they're close to nature, and they, you know, the spirit of the moon and the wolf and all the other shit that people have with elves. And I thought, well, what if some of those elves at some point in the process used their crafting? Because elves always make, you know, if you read Tolkien, elves make this beautiful, you know, the leaf-shaped brooch or whatever. But they never show you the elves in a mine. They never show you the, like, where's the elf blacksmith? They always show you, like, oh, this is a beautiful golden belt that we gave to Boromir that he was, you know, put down the River Enarin in with whatever. You remember the belt. Boromir gets this beautiful gold belt from the people of Lorien. And I thought, like, they never showed me a mine in Lorien. They never showed me a blacksmith or anybody who made gold belts. Who the fuck built this, right? And I thought somebody in elven culture must be making beautiful things. There has to be people who are craftsmen, elven craftsmen. And what if those elven craftsmen used magic and put that magic inside of their crafts? They made beautiful things, and then they put their magic inside those beautiful things and created sort of constructs, like golems, like a magical being that had its spirit imbued inside of this craft that an elf has made. And wouldn't those elves also make interesting things like chainsaws and bows that have gears on them and blah, blah, blah? That would be an interesting thing that elves might do. And then I thought, well, what if those elves did that and other elves didn't like it? Other elves said, no, we don't do that. We don't put the spirit of living things inside of unliving things. And so I created from that this whole idea of the technologist elves versus the fundamentalist elves. Some of the elves refused to believe that this was a good thing to do, while other elves thought this is our magic and this is what we do, and we've imbued these non-living things with life, and isn't that great? And now you've got a whole history, a whole lore, and a whole thing that you can play with the constructs, which are these things that the elves have made, with the technologist elves, which are the ones that built the constructs, and with the fundamentalist elves, which are the ones that refuse to believe that the constructs should have been built. And this actually right now, where the last update to Last Regiment included Shelbia, who is the leader of a band of technologist elves that lives out in the desert, who is coming in contact with Zilvera, who is the leader of a band of fundamentalist elves. And so now there's a whole rich story and background and all of that based around the basic core idea from the beginning of, I don't want my elves to be the same as all the other elves. What could I do? Now, keep in mind, I didn't just say, like, well, what I'm going to do with my elves is they're all going to speak Russian or something. I didn't just pull that out of my ass. I pulled it from elven lore. We know that elves craft. We know that elves make beautiful things. That's a thing that's always in elven society and fantasy literature. So to take that and go, how could I expand that out in a new and different direction? It was the same with the goblins. I didn't say, like, we're going to totally rethink goblins from the ground up. They're just going to look like goblins. It would be totally different. I asked myself, in a society where everybody fights, in a society where everybody lives close to each other in these kind of swamps and these forbidden places, What what kind of culture might come out of that? And that's how we built our sort of feisty, missile using, brave goblins. And for instance, one of the things when we started putting it into game terms of what kind of game things could these goblins do, I thought to myself, you know what's really brave? Flying. If you're a creature that doesn't have wings and you build balloons or dirigibles or a kite, there's actually, and I got the kite thing from, this is actually a thing they do in Nepal. I didn't know about this. In the Himalayas, they make these great big huge kites, and they actually, these monks used to tie themselves to these kites, and they would fly these kites off of the mountains of the Himalayas with this monk strapped to the kite, like, ah, you know, and they would get up there and they would look down at the mountains. That's apparently a thing they used to do. I read an article about it years and years ago, and I thought, what if the goblins did that? Right? What if a goblin strapped himself to a kite, you know, and they used him as a scout to look around in that kite? And, you know, what if he had a little explosive and he could like throw bombs from his kite? That would be fun. But it comes from that place of, what does a brave creature do? Right? A brave creature would fly like that. Maybe and I thought about, what else would a creature that's very connected to the wild, a creature that's very connected to nature and the world around it and very in tune with the world, well, they would be rangers. They would be people who understand the forest. And you know what else they would be? They would be people who would know things about animals. But these are goblins. These aren't elves. They're not friends to the animals. They're not like out there making animal buddies. They're out there dominating animals. They're out there like, I understand nature. I understand everything. I know how that spider works. And you know what? I'm going to strap a harness to it and I make that spider carry my shit for me because I'm a goblin and that's what I do, right? I live in the swamp and it's got these great big dragonfly insects. And you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to raise them. I'm going to ride them and I'm going to fly them around and I don't care when they die. When they die, I'll go get a new one, right? That's the way a goblin feels about animals. He doesn't love his animals. He's not friends with nature. That's not how the goblin sees nature. Goblin sees nature as a tool. And so now we have this race that has two interesting traits. They like to fly on things and they like to ride things or dominate and control animals. Now I've got a very interesting race and I can build all kinds of lore and whatnot out of that. So play with what the user already knows and do some stuff with what the user already knows. Now, that's the big hunks of what I wanted to talk about today. I think this has gotten way longer than I thought it would be. I hope it's interesting. I hope this is all interesting and useful to everybody. I know that I'm just like fully nerding out today, and there's got to be some people out there like, motherfuck, that guy is a nerd. But whatever, this is what I'm into. I want to just walk through some ways in which I put this into our world map and thought about our world map. And this is what I'm showing you right now is actually what I gave to our artists, right? There's a wonderful artist. His name is June, and we call him Lolo June, which means Grandpa June in Filipino, because he's a grandpa, and but he's not just a grandpa. I mean, he is actually a grandpa. He actually has grandkids. I don't know if they're plural. He has one grandkid. I don't know if he has more than one. I think it's one grandkid. But the other thing about June is he is one of the most experienced, talented artists I've ever worked with. Just a wonderful, wonderful guy. And he's done a lot of the art for Last Regiment. And so putting this map together, there were a couple people that worked on it. I believe Jeff, who's an Indonesian artist, worked on this as well. And also, I believe Greg, who's another Indonesian artist, worked on this. But the final map was put together by June, and he did a lot of the notes and things. And so I had a rough version of the map that I believe Jeff or Greg, or maybe it was June, somebody put together. And June came and finished it. So these were these are slides directly from my conversations with June about how to name things and such like that. So if we go back to my original big, huge map, there. If we go to this original huge map, I'm starting kind of from the north and I'm working my way down, right? That's what we're talking about in these maps. So you can see we're starting north of this and working our way down. I should have had one nice full color map in here. I forgot to put one because I suck. So when I was thinking about the north, I was thinking about what kind of things would happen in the north. And I thought, the north is one of the later places, because if we look at how I'll start here. I'll start in the Rumen Archipelago. So this is where the actual exploration of Kothia begins, the re-exploration of Kothia begins, because the story actually is such that the Kothia had been explored earlier, and then people, I don't want to get too deep into our particular lore, but the idea is that they're refinding this continent. They have ancient lore of how they'd been to this continent before, and they're using that ancient lore to come back to this continent and refind it. And the first place that they go is here on the Rumen Archipelago. So I noted a couple places that they would have landed. Now, when I started naming stuff, I asked myself, like, who named these things? Now, in this, there's really, if you look at the way America, or let's say America's probably the best example. If you look at the way stuff in America is named, the names come from three basic places. One, they asked somebody, what's this place called? And some Navajo or Cherokee or somebody said, this is Illinois, right? Or they asked them, what is this place called? And one of the more famous stories of American exploration, they asked the people of the Yucatan, what is this place called? And the people of the Yucatan said, I don't understand you. And I don't understand you in the native Yucatan language is Yucatan. And the Spanish were like, Yucatan it is then. We are now in the Yucatan, which means I don't understand you. So in many cases, these words don't actually mean the name of the place where they are, but they mean like, sometimes they would ask some Native American fellow, what is this river called? And they'd be like, well, this is the river where we get fish, which in that language may have sounded like Mississippi or something. I don't know what Mississippi actually means, but there's a lot of stuff that is actually not really the name that the local people had for it, but the thing that came out of the conversation with the native. So in short, it's a native word. It's a word from the native peoples. So that's one place that you might get a name of things, right? The second place that you might get a name of things, actually there's four. The second place you would get a name of things is somebody gets there and they're like, well, this looks like this, right? That rock over there looks like a horse head. There's actually, in Michigan, near my father's cabin, there's a point called Horsehead Point. When you look at it from a certain angle, kind of looks like a horse head, right? And that's a very natural way to name things. Now, in many cases, the word is actually the native word for Horsehead Point. They're like, what is that point? And the native people was like, well, we think that looks like a horse head. And the horse head in our language is Gadoodoo. And so now that's Gadoodoo Point. That happens, but often people just name it themselves. And they're like, yep, that's and also these can come from different languages. When we think about the people who are coming here, they're naming it in their own language. So one of my favorite examples is when French explorers found the Grand Teton Mountains. They looked at these mountains and they were like, those mountains look like tits. Because they do. If you've ever been to the Grand Tetons, they look like boobs, big, pointy Madonna-ish boobs, but they look like boobs. And so the French people said, we're going to call those boob mountains, which, for the record, in the word for boob in French is Teton, and grand means big. And so the Grand Teton Mountains literally mean the big breast mountains, because some French dude looked at it and was like, I see titties. And so that's a thing, right? So you can have something which is, something in the native language. You can have something which is a descriptive, that's what it looks like, but the descriptive might be in a native language, or the descriptive might be in the language of the people who found it. And so in the cases of these islands, you'll notice they have names like Sinda and Pala and Maria. And these are, I pulled a lot of these from, I took a bunch of Filipino words and kind of banged them together. I took like half of one Filipino word, stuck it to another, and then checked it on Google to make sure it wasn't actually a real word, which you have to be careful of. You can name something like Tolo and then find out Tolo actually means penis in Swahili. That happens, and you have to be careful of it. But in my mind, the language, the Portellan language, sounds kind of like Filipino. Like that's kind of, in my head, that's where I wanted it to be. And in many ways, I when I was making the Portellan people, they kind of look Filipino. They're dark-haired, they're dark-skinned. They come from a bunch of islands. Their language sounds kind of Filipino. That was my thinking when I put it together, because I needed something to draw from. So when I was coming up with names for places that the Portellans found first, they would obviously have Portellan names, right? So that was a thing that I started with from the very beginning, was stuff should sound Portellan in the places that the Portellans found first. Makes sense, right? That's funny. One of the main designers of the project never knew, who is Filipino, I should mention, never knew that I based the Filipino or the Portellan culture on his own country. See, the things people don't know. So anyway, that's the second way you can name. Another way you can name stuff is people would name stuff after somebody or something where they were, and so they might be like, I got a daughter named Isabel, and I love her very much, and I made a new place. This is Isabel's Landing. I call it that because I like my daughter Isabel. And there's a lot of stuff in America named after that, right? I happen to have been born and raised. I was born in Dallas, which was named after a guy named Dallas, near the city of Houston, which was named after Sam Houston. Austin was named after Stephen F. Austin. I grew up in a town called Garland, which was named after Mr. Garland, who happened to be, I looked this up, he was the guy that ran the post office back when that town was made. The post office guy was Mr. Garland, and I guess the post office guy was an important fella back in old Texas, whatever, and so they named it after him. So I grew up in a town named after Mr. Garland. So naming something after a person is funny things like that, right? So someone in chat's actually named Isabel. Woohoo! We have a place named after you in the game. I had no idea. Enjoy it. It doesn't actually show up anywhere in the game. It's just on the map. But yeah, we have a place named after Isabel. So you can name stuff after, what the natives called it. You can name stuff after some sort of description of what the place is like. You can name stuff after people's names. And then the last one, and this is something you see a lot in America, is there's a Paris, Texas, New York, New Jersey. These are places that are named after somewhere people came from. I didn't do a lot of that in Kothia just because I didn't like it. I always thought New York was kind of it sucks that our biggest city is named after a relatively shitty part of England. Like I always kind of get pissed about that. So I didn't want to do a lot of that, but that's certainly something that makes sense. And in that, sometimes it's not as obvious as you think. So for instance, the state north of Virginia is called Maryland, right? And it's Maryland. Well, who's Mary? Mary is Mary, Queen of Scots. And so the Maryland is actually named after Queen Mary, right? It's Mary's land. Or, for instance, Virginia, the name Virginia comes from Queen Elizabeth. Now, you don't think, why would, because she was the Virgin Queen, right? She was no virgin, by the way. That chick got around, but she never got married, so they had to call her a virgin because, in those days, if you weren't married, you didn't do it. So she was the Virgin Queen, and so they named Virginia the Virgin Colony because it was named after Elizabeth, because it was found in the time of Elizabeth. So, or the Philippines, for instance, was named after King Philip of Spain, right? Because why not? When you find a whole new people, then, hey, guess what? You're named after a king that you've never met, that has never been here and knows nothing about you. But that's why the Philippines is the Philippines. And even now, when Spain is but a distant memory in the Philippines is still called the Philippines, right? So that's a thing. Where was I? I was going to talk about some more stuff. I just got a bunch of these things. I don't want to go over this in too much detail. It's going to get old. But you can see I kind of used these ideas for Dagger Shoal Point. Well, that's a point where there's a shoal that is kind of like daggers, right? Elk Landing. Maybe that's a place where they saw elk, and there's a lot of elk there. And you can use these names, especially these descriptive names, to give a real flavor for a place. When you see the Midge Coast and you see Ice Bridge and you see Elk Landing, you're pretty sure there's not a jungle there, right? There's no elk in the jungle, right? There's no ice. You're not going to see Ice Bridge in Brazil, right? That's not a thing. So you get these, when you're putting these names together, a map is a wonderful place to open up to the player what this area might have been like. So it's also a great place to use history. So for instance, the Charlotte River here in this area, there's a reason it's named the Charlotte River. There's a character in the lore of this world, Queen Charlotte. There's a war called the Queen Charlotte War, which was fought when Charlotte was queen of Zalov, one of the main countries of the old world. And so I wanted to take some of these names from the lore and stick them into the world when they came here. And you can kind of know what time it is. So for instance, you know that the Philippines was colonized at the time of King Philip because they named him after King Philip, right? So that was who was king then. You know that Virginia was colonized in the time of Queen Elizabeth because they named it after her, right? And so you kind of know that in the history, we named Charlotte River after Charlotte when she was queen. So we can kind of put in our heads together that this was named at the time that there was a Queen Charlotte. And that ties your map and your geography and your history together in a really nice way. The Merchant Coast. I called this the Merchant Coast because I wanted this particular part to be, in my mind, I thought about there would be a lot of gold and minerals and rich stuff here. As they went up the Charlotte River, they found stuff. And so merchants would come here trading for fur and for these rich things that come from the north. Why did people go up to the north? They went up to the north to find furs. Now, where does that come from? Well, it comes from the history of Canada, of course, right? That's why Quebec exists, right? People went there for fur and for things like that. So I thought that would be an interesting thing to do. Now you'll notice a number of places I named Fort something. And again, this gives you a feeling of, well, you don't really build a fort unless you are protecting yourself against something. So it gives you that feeling of, well, when the people came here, there were goblins and things that were fighting against them, and they had to build a fort to protect themselves against it, right? Now here, this is the islands north of this area right here. And this is the original homeland of the Fae, the elves in our legend and lore. And here it made a lot more sense for me that most things would have old names because the elves named it that way and they've lived here forever. And these places haven't really been colonized. And because they haven't really been colonized, they still maintain their old names. In the same way that if you walk around Japan, which was also never colonized, there's not a lot of shit in Japan that doesn't have Japanese names. Right? And so in my mind, I thought, all right, the elves have kept this to themselves. There was a war up here. The Faeborn took it over from the elves. The blah, blah, blah. There's this place never got colonized. Now, someone might point out, but why are these straits between these two islands called the Cold Tongue Straits? And I did that on purpose. I did that because I wanted there to be an elvish word for that. And somebody has learned, because the elves have a long history and a long lore, somebody has learned that that's the Cold Tongue Straits from the elves and had it translated. But at some point, some elf would be like, oh, we don't call it that. We call it the whatever in Elven, right? So I thought that'd be kind of fun. You can see a lot more of the same stuff over and over again. Now here, I will tell you one way, when you get to naming a whole bunch of stuff, at some point, you're going to get tired and you're going to be like, I don't know what to name stuff. Don't worry. Search Bay, Heron Bay, and Manitou Bay, all of these happen to be small inlets around my dad's lake house in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Now, why there? Well, because this area is kind of a similar place. It's a forested coast and blah, 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 and it kind of made sense. And I kind of looked around and found stuff like that. Now, no one's going to call me out on it being Search Bay. I mean, Search Bay sounds like something. There's a story behind it. And sometimes you can just name some shit and it's all right. I could go on, but I think this is probably getting a bit tedious. So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about today. I'll go back to my very first slide, map making for designers. I hope this was useful and interesting to you. I don't know if it was or wasn't. This got long. But anyway, I'm going to do more of this. There's going to be another one next week. That's how I make maps and make lore for maps. I hope that was interesting to you. I'll see you again next week.